Hi everyone, I hope you can hear me. It's wonderful to be here, and I'd just like to reiterate the thanks to the Franke family, to Dolores Cole Kaplan, to the Kaplan Institute, to everyone at Chicago Humanities Festival. It's made this such a joy to be involved with this enterprise. The topic, the title of my talk, Reconnecting Art and Science, may not immediately be seen to connect, obviously, to the theme of the festival, graphic. However, I hope in this talk to take you on a little journey in a way that you might be able to see how the term graphic might provide one key to unlocking perhaps a vista to how the arts and the sciences might in our society connect together. And I'm going to start with a word coined in the 19th century by the author of this book, a guy called William Whewell, who wrote a book, as you can see, about the history of the inductive sciences and coined a term, consilience. Some of you might know this word. It was the title of a book by E.O. Wilson that I'll put it up on the screen, that came out in 1998. But by consilience, Whewell, the 19th century author, who really was a scientist, sought to use this word, which joined the Latin word for together, cum, with the Latin word for jumping. And by jumping together, he was looking for a way in which ideas that emerge from empirical scientific observation might jump together in different categories and lead to a type of inductive conclusion or inductively gained conclusion, that is, deducing generalities from specifics. Now, E.O. Wilson picked up on this term in his book, Consilience, on the unity of knowledge, seeking to weave together the arts and sciences, the arts and humanities, and the sciences through expanding this notion of jumping together to all sorts of disciplines. And in that book, which was quite controversial at the time, he railed also against the way in which the humanities had sort of lost its track into postmodern relativism and epistemological relativism. But nonetheless, I think his effort to try and join the arts and the sciences together was an honorable one. And I think it's one that, to me, is particularly important, because I happen in my professional life to be called a dean of something, a dean of a college of arts and science, and therefore I find it almost incumbent upon me to start thinking through, well, what exactly does it mean to join the arts, something we call the arts, and something we call the sciences into today's society? And I'd like you just to pay attention to the and for a moment, because an and, the conjunction, of course, joins two, in this case, different entities, seeking some sort of reconciliation between the two, but it also distinguishes between the two. And before I continue, I'd like to make the point that although I am eager to reconnect the arts and the sciences in ways that Phil just alluded to, the fact is they're already joined daily in many ways. I'm thinking of the students' minds who pass through curricula like the one we offer in the arts and sciences, where they start in a sociology class, but then they go to study physics, and then they go to study art history, my discipline. And in doing that, in their own minds, they weave together and bind together disparate fields of knowledge and different methodologies across a great range of areas. And so in some ways, is it even necessary to reconnect these entities when it happens every day in institutions like this one? However, despite my bullishness on the undergraduate education here and at other places like this, which does have students pass through these various areas, I think turning back to what C.P. Snow called in his famous 1959 Reed lecture, The Two Cultures, this notion of a culture of humanistic thinking or artistic thinking and a culture of scientific thinking, it still remains in today's society. And it's worth thinking through how we might bind them together. Now, C.P. Snow is a chemist and a novelist. Some of you may know his works. And he was writing at a time really about the English educational system, not sort of a global sense of arts and humanities. He was really just bemoaning the fact that scientists seemed so unable to distinguish things like a dactylic hexameter from an iambic pentameter, and on the reverse side, that humanists had no idea what thermodynamics were or Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, this idea that we all ought to somehow be stretching beyond our own disciplinary areas in order to understand how very different fields operate. And I wanted just to point, while I'm going through this sort of bibliographical introduction, to a really fabulous book from 2003 by the late Stephen Jay Gould, this posthumous book given the wonderful title, The Hedgehog, the Fox, and the Magister's Pox, in which Gould, a scientist, sought to critique Wilson and critique other attempts to bind the humanities and sciences together, and really stated something which I think is essential, that any attempt to take people from disparate fields as disparate as, let's say, poetry and physics, and seeking to have them speak together requires respect. Respect for the methods and the norms of the other person's area. And I think that's something in today's world that we need to remind ourselves, certainly in academia, but beyond. And so today I will be thinking through with you what it is to both respect different areas, to think through how they might be conjoined, and I will be focusing, certainly at the end of my talk, on how the word graphic itself might provide a pathway. So before I go any further, I think it's worth just noting how the word arts and the word sciences are framed broadly in today's society. I think if you think about arts, we think about the creative arts, we think about performing arts, visual arts, literary arts. And when we think about the sciences, we tend to think about observational science, experimental science, and certainly quantitatively inflected thinking. And before I'm just laying that out there as a very fundamental sort of split between these areas, or difference between these areas. But before I go even further, I want to wonder whether it is even possible to think about reconciling these two areas with one another. First of all, even just the way I defined those terms, the arts and the sciences are potentially so ranging, so disparate, and they encompass so many things that perhaps even thinking about drawing them together may be a fool's errand, although it's one I'm on. Secondarily, the boundaries between the arts and the sciences are actually blurred every day. And I will be showing you some examples from the past where they're blurred. But the fact is, I acknowledge it, as you see, there's so many initiatives that take scientists into humanistic realms and artistic realms and vice versa, that perhaps, although this has been a battle that was played out in the Middle Ages between scholastics and academics, in the Renaissance between humanists and their opponents, in the 17th century between the so-called anciens and the other modernes, and then in the science wars of the 1990s, maybe this is a generational thing, that every generation or two you need to have this battle between areas. But the reality in human history is that quite often they've operated together as opposed to being antagonistic. And finally, perhaps these terms, even though they are part of my business card, maybe they need redefining, they need refreshing, they need to be defined in very different ways. And with that in mind, I'm going to start my talk today, well, I already started it, but I'm going to start the next section of it by looking really at new definitions. And before doing that, one more caveat. I'm going to be looking at early modern European examples, examples largely from the 15th and 17th century. And this is the area I know, this is the area I research, it's an area I feel quite comfortable in. However, I want to admit at the outset that this type of thinking would profitably gain from some input from Sung Dynasty China, or examples from medieval Baghdad, or examples from other indigenous knowledges that might transform the way we think about these issues. And even though I'm not competent to do that now, I hope one day maybe I could bring that into a talk like this. But for now, I'm going to stay with the benighted European tradition, which has its advantages, but also its blind spots and its problems. So defining terms anew. I'm just going to give you the structure of my talk. I'm going to have one section on, it's pretty short, defining the terms arts and sciences in ways I find useful. I'm then going to move on to something I've called design thinking in Renaissance Italy. And I'm going to look at some examples from squarely in my own area of competence, 15th century Florence. Then I'll move on to the 17th century and look at an early modern scientist and some of his work, Robert Hooke's Micrographia, And you'll notice the graphia there. And then finally, I'm going to try and come back to consilience, the word that is sort of hovering around my talk, and try to put the graphane back in graphic. I'll tell you what that means later. So first of all, defining these terms anew. I work on medieval and Renaissance Italy. I say that because 14th and 15th century, no one knows whether it's medieval or Renaissance, and it doesn't really matter. They didn't think about it in those terms themselves anyway. But when I hear the word art, because I've spent my life reading about these terms, it doesn't immediately mean to me painting, sculpture, architecture. Instead, I think of what the word artium in Latin or the word arte in Italian in the period meant, which in the period I work on, it meant trade or practice. In other words, if you were an artist, they didn't really have that term so directly in the period, but if you were that, you were producing things, whether it was gloves or wheels or furniture or paintings. And in some sense, I want to return to the word art in its early modern Italian sense, a notion of practice, what it is to do something, what it is to perform something that's learned practice, to do something repetitive, to learn how to do it and produce something. Whereas science returns in, or the connotation of science in the period in which I work, has to do with knowledge. The word scientia in Latin or scienza in Italian just means knowledge or the creation of knowledge. And it's these sort of connotations for me that sort of ripple around those terms. And when I think of the arts and sciences, I really want to encourage us to think about what it would mean to invest these terms with that notion of practice and knowledge. Because I think when we talk about the arts and sciences today, for example, in the title of Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences, I think we think of it as denoting areas of endeavor, as if there is a terrain into which you go to learn the arts or to learn the sciences. But I would rather think about these as conceptual units, areas that are to do with the methodology of practicing something and gaining knowledge about something, and those two terms, practice and knowledge, almost being intertwined in a mutually beneficial relationship, so that as one learns how to do something, one also is gaining knowledge, and that knowledge then re-inflects the way in which one performs. So I'll turn now to my second part. That was the very quick initial part. I think you should be happy. It's going pretty quickly through my series of examples. The bad news is this is the big part. This one's going to go on. But there are lots of pictures, which makes it much better than that black and white text on a screen hundreds of feet away. So, well, that's a good place to begin. Well, I'll start with design thinking, first of all. Design thinking, I'm sure many of you have heard about this. It's a mode that's very popular now of thinking about how you design things, but also how you design organizations. And it's thinking about the user interface. How does one design something for its use? And I like transporting that term back into the period. And you can see I like transporting Renaissance terms to now, and I'm going to transport this term back to the 15th century, to think about how artists like, I'll show him again now, Leonardo, thought about his practice and the way in which it invested his objects with a type of knowledge. So he's famous for producing paintings like this, which you can probably see somewhere back there on the screen, the Mona Lisa, which in some ways is just a portrait, a rendition of someone's face. But in other ways, and many art historians have unpacked this, it really becomes a meditation or a manifesto on humans' relationship to nature. And this is something that runs through Leonardo's practice, through his drawings in particular. And I'm showing you here a drawing, I don't know if I've got a pointer on this, maybe I do, drawing of a sort of the inside of a person's head, and he's likening it actually, and you can't see that so well, to an onion and the layers of an onion. And he did a lot of these types of analogies with nature and human anatomy. The pointer is not really what he's doing in this particular drawing, so much as the act of drawing as being a mode of discovery. And in fact, I like to think about this analogy of the stylus, whether it be an ink or whether it be a crayon or whether it be a stylus of another sort in the Renaissance, somehow being akin to the scalpel when it comes to anatomy, of sort of marking on the surface and thinking through what is inside this body, what is the way in which it operates. And that same spirit of inquiry carries over into Leonardo's many, many, many studies of water in movement. The eddying, the vortical spinning, the splashing, the way in which it reacts when one element of water, one part, sort of you pour water into another part of water, his drawings become the exploration into nature. And I make this point about drawing because the Italian word for drawing is disegno. And that means a drawing, un disegno. But it also is invested with this notion of design. So if you think of our word design in English, it has an ambivalence, right? You think about designing something. You can design a kitchen. You can design a chair. You can design your life. You know, design is an activity of plotting and planning conceptualization. But then a design is also a thing. This is the design for the kitchen. This is the plan I have. And I think that ambivalence is in the word disegno in Italian, but invested also with a true deep sense of conceptualization. So a drawing like this is not simply a visual marker, a graphic, and if you know, I'm sure those of you who know museums, you know the graphic works are works like this, two-dimensional, marked works of art. These are not simply representations or illustrations, they actually are visual thinking. And I think this becomes perhaps even clearer when we move to Leonardo's engineering drawings, ones like this, which is sort of how do you get water, hydraulic machinery working? And he's thinking this through in multiple drawings on the same sheet, partly because paper was expensive, but also because he's thinking through problems from a variety of angles through his activity of designing. And I think you see this too in the work of Michelangelo. This is just another example, preliminary actually example, how Michelangelo uses drawing in a similar vein, exploring the human body through anatomical drawings like this one, seeing the torque and the tension and seeing the muscles on the back of this individual, turning and seeing it in an extreme pose in order to invest, in this case, the Sistine Chapel ceiling and the Libyan Sibyl with a type of credible corporeal presence. But this is also investing Michelangelo's other explorations. Michelangelo was one of the greatest military architects of his day, designing battlements, like this one at the top left for you. And using, I think, as one study has recently proposed, his anatomical knowledge almost to give the walls a type of bodily torsion and torque, a bit like it's a type of engineered body that repels the enemy. Now, I'm turning to Leonardo and Michelangelo because they're the most obvious examples of what we sometimes think of as the Renaissance man, but I would rather call it a Renaissance human, a Renaissance individual who somehow embodies a type of polymathic approach to the world, not just one realm of knowledge, but poetry, drawing, painting, conceptualization, and making military battlements, making hydraulic machinery. This type of multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity is really at the core of what Renaissance art theorists thought of as disegno. And that term is very useful, I think. And I wanted to remind those of you with a Latinate turn of mind that the equivalent word in Latin is arguably graphicae. It is actually the word at the heart of the festival, this notion of producing a painting or a drawing or a mark. And that goes back to the Greek graphein, to which I will return at the end of my talk. So these visual thinkers, Leonardo and Michelangelo, the most famous, and I'm sure some of you have read the Walter Isaacson biography, the recent one, right? Has anyone seen that? It's a wonderful book. There are many wonderful books about both of these individuals that gives you a taste of their rather capacious intellects. But actually, I wanted to talk about Brunelleschi. You know, the oft-forgotten, but still quite famous individual who's far more complex, I think, than many studies give him credit for. Now, to many of you who've been to Florence, the slide on the right there might be slightly uncomfortable. It's really what Brunelleschi saw around 1418, that is 500 years ago this year, when confronted with the problem of how to span the enormous gap left by the 14th century builders who produced this cathedral, Florence Cathedral, Santa Maria del Fiore. And in trying to come up with a solution about how to span this huge space with the dome, there were really only very few models. I'm showing you the one there at the top left there of the Pantheon in Rome, where a very shallow sort of concrete dome was produced really a millennium before. But that didn't really tell Florentines how to produce what they wanted to produce, What they wanted was a dome that looked like this one. I don't know if you can see that, this sort of nice petal-shaped almost, or umbrella-type dome, which rose up, sort of bulbous, and capped off by a lantern. The Pantheon couldn't give them that. And they knew they wanted this already in 1367, when this fresco by Andrea di Buonaiuti in the chapter house of Santa Maria Novella, you don't need to know that, but was produced. So in the fresco in 1367, they knew they wanted that, but what they had was over on the right-hand side. And so the question that Brunelleschi was posed, and many people had posed it, had sort of posed it to themselves before him, but none had found the solution, was how to solve this problem. Now, the normal way to solve a problem of making vaulting is to build a wooden scaffolding under a dome and then sort of lay the masonry on top, put a keystone in, and then take away the wooden centering. That could not work in this case because there wasn't enough wood in Italy to produce the scaffolding you would need in order to produce the type of structure underneath the masonry to support it. So instead, Brunelleschi turned to some solutions which I'm sure some of you must have studied when you were undergraduates. I'm just guessing that someone was in a class where Brunelleschi's solution was studied. And he produced that. Sorry, that's my little Photoshop. I try not to do too many cute things, but that one seems to, you know, it took a bit longer. It took about 30 years, but you get the idea. And how did Brunelleschi do it? Well, one thing he did is he understood that in order to build this dome, it wasn't simply a matter of having a great design. It was a matter of almost inventing the machinery necessary to bring the 40,000 tons of material needed to produce this dome. And it is a light dome, believe it or not, but the fact is, because of its size, it's just an enormous amount of material. And Brunelleschi, in his wisdom, realized that he needed to design these winches that could be sort of geared in two directions. He invented carts that could mechanically be used to sort of move very heavy loads around the building site. And he also designed a system which really has become canonical in the history of art. And I know this sort of cross-section, modern cross-section, is difficult to understand, but he made a double dome. So what you see on the outside is simply a light sort of umbrella-like shell over the outside, and inside there is a more conically shaped dome which sent the forces, the weight forces, down more horizontally, I'm sorry, I'm not an engineer, down to the walls, reducing the amount of outward thrust. Now, because if you tried building a dome the size of the outside dome, a lot of that thrust would be pushing out at the springing of the dome and really be structurally unsound or structurally very difficult to restrain. So Brunelleschi came up with an idea. He came up with an idea also to produce brickwork. He made 4 million bricks, specially designed bricks in a herringbone fashion that could be put together in a herringbone fashion that produced sort of a tensile strength in the skin such that instead of needing wooden centering, it would sort of hold itself up as it was being built. Now, I'm going to cut to the chase. The fact is, Brunelleschi could see solutions. He could see through the problems to solutions that others couldn't. And the question is why? I don't believe that it's just the solitary genius managed to do this. He was supported by a community of people who were thinking this through with him, a community of workers who executed this. But he also was blessed with a number of experiences that led to him seeing the problem before him from a very cross-disciplinary way. So the first thing we know about Brunelleschi is that he was trained as a goldsmith. He wasn't an architect, he wasn't a mason, he wasn't an engineer. Engineers didn't really exist. But he came from a discipline which made him think about how to design metal objects. And already in 1401, and I'm sure some of you recognize this, and if you don't, you'd be graded down on the midterm, the object on the right, which is his competition panel for the baptistry doors at Florence Cathedral. Again, one of those canonical moments in the history of art, and I'm seeing some people smiling and nodding, maybe some scowling of having got that ID wrong in a midterm a few years ago. But he was thinking through compositional problems, how to tell a story, how to have individuals either react or not react. This, of course, is the story of Abraham and Isaac. This is the patriarch Abraham told to sacrifice his son, his only son, and stopped at the last minute by the angel, but also thinking through the technology of bronze casting, which for us may seem pretty rudimentary. In the 15th century, that's nanotechnology. I mean, that's the most advanced thing you could imagine, bronze casting. And therefore, Brunelleschi had experiences across the technical, the artistic, the compositional, etc. He also, and this may be difficult to decipher in this slide, this is a 1970s reproduction of the mechanical sort of stage machinery that Brunelleschi invented to perform sacred plays in Florentine churches. Florence was famous for having these very sort of multimedia, what I think of as slightly Disneyland-esque type of plays, where they would show the Assumption of the Virgin and have an actor sort of winched up to the ceiling and then spinning angels around this with lots of cotton wool and even fireworks. That's, if you want to know why Santo Spirito was rebuilt in the 15th century, it's because those fireworks got a little out of hand. It was a very dangerous enterprise, but Brunelleschi was famous for this engineering of these stage sets. And my proposition is that Brunelleschi, because of his experience, his multifaceted experience of trying to solve problems that range from theatrical performances or proto-theatrical performances to bronze casting, to composition in the visual arts, to architecture, to the machines necessary to build things, this type of cross-disciplinary thinking, which required a type of consilience and design, is something that helped him see things that others could not. And while I'm on seeing, another thing Brunelleschi is famous for, and I think quite rightly so, are his experiments, his optical experiments that led to the development of systematic linear perspective. And I'm showing you here a couple of illustrations. These are reenactments, if you will, in graphic terms of one experiment Brunelleschi did at the Baptistry of Florence, where he produced a panel, a painted panel, showing you this view. This is the actual baptistry staring towards the building. He drilled a hole in the middle of the panel. And he produced the panel, I should say, according to rules or nascent rules of linear perspective. He drilled a hole in the panel and held it up to his face, stood in the door of the cathedral, Santa Maria del Fiore, the place where the dome was, and looked through it at the baptistry in front of him, and then took a mirror and could shift the mirror forward, sort of into his line of vision and out. And what this permitted him to do was several important things. He could test the reality of what he was seeing with his one eye peering through the little hole, the baptistry, against his representation, which he would see mirrored in the mirror. Now, why is that important? Because what Brunelleschi is doing is positing an equivalence between the science of vision, which was seen as sort of governed by geometrical, optical, Euclidean rules, and the world, which then he could prove in a way through this experiment, this quasi-scientific experiment, actually was also governed by scientific geometrical rules. And this equivalent between the spectator's interior way of thinking about space and the reality of a perceived space came to be realized in paintings. And I'm going to leave the one on the right, even though it's a wonderful painting, but I'm going to leave that to a side for a minute. But just focus on this one, which I think you can see from there. This is Masaccio's Trinita in Santa Maria Novella, a Dominican church in Florence, which painted in a fresco painted in the mid-1420s, and it posits a horizon line here and a point in the fresco where all of the lines that seem to be perpendicular to the surface of the painting recede down to that line, and that line corresponds to a space, roughly around here actually, in the nave of the church, where if you stand and you close one eye, it appears as if you are looking into this barrel-vaulted space that looks as if it's an extension of your lived space. It really is a very convincing illusion of that type of just punching a hole in the wall. And in that wall is the Trinity, God the Father, Holy Ghost, Mary, John the Evangelist, and two patrons who are just on the outside. Also, interestingly, and I won't go into it, is a skeleton there below with the inscription in Italian, "I am what you will be," which is a bit more morbid. But it does posit the viewer as sort of right in front of that fresco. And what I like, or what I propose thinking about with you, is the way in which this fresco, similarly to the experiment at the baptistry, posits the expected horizon of the viewer. As the viewer moves, the bipedal, bifocal viewer moves around looking for horizons with a pictured horizon in the painting. That may seem an obvious point, but I think it's one that has a profound effect, certainly on illusionism in painting, but also I think in the history of just thinking. And so let me show you a couple of other fascinating ways that artists and architects extended space, and I think, therefore, produced an extension of the human mind. This is a wonderful little, similarly barrel-vaulted little colonnade in a palace in Rome. This is from the 1630s. This is not a painting. This is an actual architectural element. And one walks there and sees that statue in the background and thinks, oh, that's a pretty long hallway. If you think it through sort of mathematically, it looks like it's about 120 feet long. But then when you see a person go up to the statue in the background, you realize the statue is just a little miniature statue. And the space implied, the real space there, is just about 30 feet. So what Borromini's doing is tricking you, and I like it that you laugh. I think that's part of the intention. I think the joyousness of seeing things and then understanding them differently at the heart of this sort of meeting of the horizon of expectation of the viewer and the horizon that's offered up to us by the artist, in this case the architect. This happens in a very different way in the later 17th century in ceiling paintings like this one by Fra Andrea Pozzo in the church of San Ignazio, the St. Ignatius in Rome. And here, if one stands in the center of the nave and looks up, and looks into the ceiling, one of course does find one does find a perspectival construction. If you follow these lines, you will find a vanishing point and an implied horizon. But of course, because you're looking upwards into the celestial spheres, it just sort of dissolves into clouds. And so in this case, illusionism and the extension of human vision and thought is put at the service of a religious message, in this case, the apotheosis of Ignatius. But I think it also tells the human brain that there are things beyond the visible world. Now, I'm not saying I'm not getting religious on you here, but there's things beyond what you see and is physically there that can extend the human brain, the human mind, into another space. And I think these illusionistic developments out of Brunelleschi's experiments in the streets of Florence point to a type of epistemological extension. Now, I'm going to step back a moment. Oh, well, sorry, I did actually throw this up. This wasn't just actually the computer coming on. I think some of these ideas are so familiar to us today that we've forgotten them. When we look at our devices and we look at them and we see other worlds, whether you're looking at a video of a dog performing funny acts or, jumping around, or whether you're looking for information or whether you're looking at photographs of loved ones, you're extending your world into something else. And these devices are sort of both fabulous and terrifying, but they do provide, they're based basically on the metaphor of the painted surface as a window along the lines that Brunelleschi explored already in the 15th century. But now let me step back into the 17th century for a moment and explore a different type of science and a different type of thinking. Robert Hooke is probably one of the sort of less well-known of the luminaries of the scientific revolution. In the 17th century, Newton, and in the 16th century, Galileo, these mathematically minded scientists are seen as really founding modern science, partly because today we can recognize in their mathematical formulae things that are recognizable to us. I'm not a mathematician, but I'm assured by mathematicians that when you read what they were arguing, it's familiar. When you look at Hooke's microscope, this thing over here, that is not familiar to a contemporary scientist. This looks rudimentary, it looks ridiculous. But in the period, this type of experimental science, I would like to posit, is if not equally, perhaps more important than some of the science that's often seen as the origin of our own experimental and observational science today. So Hooke was famous in his time for the construction of microscopes like the one on the right, like the air pump, like mechanical spring work mechanisms. He was a maker. He was a doer. He linked practice to knowledge in a very fundamental way. And he did it famously in this treatise, this Micrographia, or some physiological descriptions of minute bodies. And what the Micrographia is a book that describes with words, but importantly also with illustrations, the world he discovered through what he calls magnifying glasses, but what we would call a microscope. And I'm showing you here his illustration of a flea. Now this flea is blown up to be 18 inches long. And it's on a fold-out in this early modern book from the 1660s. It's a window onto a universe that humans had not understood existed before. And it's rendered in graphic form by Hooke, who's thinking, how can I communicate this to a public audience? This flea, and I'm going to show you the fly, which is equally as detailed and extraordinary, I think is another type of fusion of knowledge and practice, which links, instead of having us like Brunelleschi looking onto a horizon out there in the world and punching a hole in the wall, instead has us think about our environment, the small things, the infinitesimally small, opening up a different sort of horizon, which for us today is second nature. The nature of scientific visualization, opening up all of those tiny, tiny things that inform, especially medicine, but all of our scientific discoveries. And Hooke rests at the beginning of this tradition. And I think it's interesting, Hooke, his first job, his first apprenticeship was with Peter Lilly, probably the most important portrait painter and painter in London in the day. And so he had, although he was only in that workshop a very short time, he developed the skills to be able to represent. And I suppose my fundamental point here is it's all very well to look through a microscope, but it's Hooke's ability to show others what he saw is really what made the difference. And I think that graphic representation, to come back to our theme, is something that I find particularly telling and particularly meaningful in the context of this festival. So now let me conclude with consilience, or actually a word I'm beginning to prefer. I want to coin the term commiscience, a commingling or commixing, by putting the graphene back into graphic. Brunelleschi's looking through, perspectiva, that means looking through something, produced an equivalence between the horizon of expectations, what the viewer brought to a work of art or anything, and the world produced, in that case by linear perspective, blurring the boundary between the virtual and the actual. Robert Hooke's microscopes opened up another world, that world of the very, very, very tiny. And these types of visual thinking were made trenchant, I think, through their graphic representation, rather than simply their being there and being in the person's mind. And I like the notion of mark-making or graphike, or the Greek graphene, to be sort of the leitmotif of what this means, leading explicitly to Hooke's, the title of Hooke's treatise. So the Greek word graphene means to scratch, to make a mark, to draw, to paint, or to write. And I think when we think of the word graphy as a suffix, I think probably the most immediate meaning of that word, certainly the one that I think I was taught, was, oh, it means writing. When I think of biography or hagiography or historiography, I think we think of graphos and the whole notion of graphy and graphic being about writing. But I think in today's society also, in English, we understand that it has multiple meanings. When you think of the graphic novel, when you think of even photography or infographics, all of those words, as that great video I think implied, seems to keep in tension both writing and image making. And I love the word graphic at the heart of what brings us here today, because it keeps word and image in this tight, sometimes a little bit tense relationship. But it also, I think, can help us bring arts and sciences together in interesting ways. I hear in my desire to have consilience be one of the leitmotifs as well, a type of joining together across disciplines. And what I'd like to encourage is that we think through, with one last citation, what it might mean to have the horizons of our horizons match with those of others. And I'll just read you this citation and then I'll end. This is from a philosopher called Hans-Georg Gadamer, a German guy. He wrote a treatise in 1960 called Wahrheit und Methode, Truth and Method. And this is the citation. The horizon is the range of vision that includes everything that can be seen from a particular vantage point. A person who has no horizon is someone who does not see far enough and hence overvalues what is nearest. On the other hand, to have a horizon means not being limited to what is nearby, but being able to see beyond. Working out, and this gets a bit complex, the hermeneutical situation means achievement of the right horizon of inquiry for the questions evoked by the encounter with tradition. Now, I know that got a little complex, but I think what this means to me is that if we are to think beyond the nearness of our own parochial interests, whether they be in the arts, the humanities, or the sciences, we need to raise our sights up, to look to the horizon. And that is a meeting place. It is not to say that my vantage point is better than yours, or better than someone from a different culture, or even the material world out there, which has its own sort of presence as having a horizon. And I think through something like the consilience that I started with, we could think about fusing horizons and thinking across disciplinary boundaries instead of being hidebound by the truths that we think we know in our own narrow worlds. So with that, I'll close, and I'd appreciate your questions.
Hi, folks. So we'll have 2 mics circulating on either side of the room. Just raise your hand and we'll come right to you. We're going to bounce back and forth across the aisles. All right, we'll start right up here, right in the middle. Could you pass this right down to him?
Professors, certainly enjoyed the lecture. Thank you very much. I was wondering, you started by talking about polymaths, and you started at a point where everybody could know everything in the world. The Leonardos, you know, it was possible to know everything. Is it possible that art and science started splitting because the nature of knowledge became so broad that you had to start dividing, conquering, splitting things up? Just was wondering if that's innate, if it was necessarily had to happen.
I think it's even more of a problem. I mean, yes, I think you're right. I think that's a natural one point of causation, why it's necessary to have different fields of knowledge when the notion of knowledge is expanding. I think as you were talking, I was thinking, well, what about now? When we have more information than the human brain, even in our collective, we can possibly encompass. And I think as I was driving here, I was thinking a little bit about, you know, this talk. I do think there are some individuals who can, even today, and I mentioned Stephen Jay Gould, there are some people who, despite expectations, seem to have brains large enough to encompass a great range of information. But I think actually we have to start thinking about not individuals so much as collectives and communities, what it means to belong to even the arts, the humanities. I mean, I see divisions, social sciences, natural sciences, what it means to belong to a group and to have those groups think across the boundaries rather than imagining we all have to be little Leonardos. Which sounds like Dylan Thomas. I don't know if that is. What's that, something about, you know, the child's Christmas or something about. But anyway, do you know what I mean? So I think it's, I'm not presenting Brunelleschi as maybe if you're good, someday you can grow up to be Brunelleschi, but rather, or I think the allegory I'm extracting from that is less about individuals, and I was trying to sort of refer to it obliquely, but more maybe now as a community we can start developing that. But I think you're absolutely right. In terms of historical, sort of the development of ideas, I think absolutely when so much information starts flowing in the 17th century and certainly in the 19th century, specialization kicks in. And in another version of this talk, I talk about, or at least I have in a different setting, spoke about Wilhelm von Humboldt and the founding of the modern university, which on the one hand was predicated on a sort of notion of culture in Germany, of encompassing everything from, you know, soup to nuts. But on the other hand was the beginning of disciplinarity. So I'm an art historian, I know about art history, I know very little about, you know, literature or very little about science. And so in some ways you're right, the expansion of knowledge caused that specialization. However, we have to fight against it as well. But maybe as groups, not as individuals, I guess is what I'm saying. I'm not expecting every scientist to be, you know, to play violin and love Chaucer, and every poet to be sort of, you know, troubling over, I don't know, proteomics or something. Do you know what I mean? So I think that's an unreal hypothesis. A bit of that is good. There was a hand at the back.
We have a question in the back.
Thank you. I've been thinking about the impact of culture on what we see, and I'm wondering why you think people who saw perspective since time immemorial, yet they didn't paint it until the Renaissance. And I was wondering why not?
Yeah, I'm of the belief that it is very culturally specific. You know, there's a great art historian, Erwin Panofsky, who wrote a really fabulous treatise on this issue, basically saying, you know, as soon as you invent perspective, you invent a way of seeing, and it becomes a cognitive pattern. I believe that. I actually don't believe that the world is constructed geometrically, or if it is, it's a very different geometry than that, because of course the world, I mean, if you take it in a gross sense, is round, and it doesn't have a flat floor in the same way, but even the eye is not constructed like they thought in a rectangular way. It's constructed in a curved way. So I don't think it is to be taken for granted. It is a way of seeing that's proved to be very compelling to the human brain. In other words, video games work because linear perspective provides you with a compelling, at least those ones that immerse you. I'm not a great video game player, but I'm guessing this isn't necessarily the audience that's huge into video games. I could be wrong. No, I have no idea. But you know what I mean? That sort of that virtual reality thing is predicated on linear perspective, inviting us to believe in that space. So it's credible, but I don't think it should be given. And if you look at other cultures, very different ways of representing space. I always remember there was a book I read when I was an undergraduate in, and now I'm going to sound like I am arts and sciences, an anthropology class about a people in Africa, I can't remember which one, that lived in forests, and therefore people of the forest, I remember the name of the book, and they lived in this close proximity, and so when they went on the plane, they couldn't understand the difference between animals that were large and animals that were small in the distance. You know, they didn't have that sense of diminution of scale because their lives had been so constrained spatially before that. I don't know if that's a tall tale, but it always impressed it upon myself.
We've got a question right back up here.
I'll try and get you.
Thank you. Are we okay?
Yeah, I was just saying the next one, there's another hand down here, but go ahead.
Sure. Okay. So the first computer painting just sold for X amount of thousands of dollars. And so from what I understand from your lecture, which was fantastic, is that the graphics were, and the illustrations and the construction were a way of expressing a thought. Mm-hmm. So how do we reconcile that? Was the computer thinking of expressing anything when it painted or when it's writing music? What does that do to that paradigm?
All I heard was the lecture was fantastic, and then my mind just turned off. No, to answer your point, I don't have a great answer for you. I mean, as you were talking, I've seen that picture, which, you know, I mean, it's a picture. I mean, and you know, there are these, I have a friend who works on, you know, sort of the natural origins of painting, and he works on elephants that paint. You know, have you seen the ones where elephants are going? And I love elephants. I mean, I actually really do. They're fabulous animals. But I don't know that okay, let me say this. In the Renaissance, I would make a plea for the intentional act of painting as being a type of visualization of thought. In the 20th century, I mean, many of you must know, there's automatic painting, there's channeling the unconscious, you know, you throw some things and then you make a pattern. And I think that's art in the contemporary context. So it depends what you define as art. Computer art or computer-generated art is actually quite old. There's been a lot of it since the 1960s. But that one is sort of interesting because it's trying to use AI. It's trying to mimic a type of thought. Whether a robot, or if that's the right word, or some sort of mechanical object can have the same notion of an idea, I think that we're on the edge of experimenting with that now, right? I mean, that's the singularity, and if you know that, I mean, this is something we trouble over. You know, you just have to go see a movie, you know? I mean, there's robots and AI things killing us in the future all the time, and I think humans are worried about that. We're worried about automation in our industries, but also, you know, if you talk to lawyers, they're worried about automation of their practices, or journalists. You know, now you can just plug in the baseball score sheet and it'll pump out an article about the game. Do you know what I mean? So there's a lot of automation going on where I think, what is the idea and what does it mean to be sentient? And I think it's been thrown into question. So I don't have a great answer for you. I do know that Leonardo is still winning because that was $450 million that it went for this summer. So I think we still like the human stuff better, although I don't think it's by Leonardo, but that's another question. Oh, now there's lots of hands. Well, it's his lecture. He should get to ask the question. Yeah. So one there, and then...
Yeah, let's bounce over there, and we'll come back over here.
You have a question down front.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. W.O. Wilson also said in Consilience that scientists and humanists speak a different language and think in a different way. Do you agree with that?
Yes and no. It's a very humanistic answer. Peter Alabod, sic non. Sorry. So on the one hand, I think E.O. Wilson was right. And let me say it this way. I do think the distinct realms of knowledge ask certain questions and get certain answers. I don't think you can ask a question of a sonnet by using the tools of astronomy. I don't think you can look at the planets and bring the tools of a poet to bear. So I do think there are different questions in different realms, and I think those should be respected. I didn't actually get back to respect, but I think we should respect the tools of science, the respects of arts, or the tools of humanities. Having said that, I read the book of someone like Wilson or someone like Stephen Jay Gould, both distinguished scientists, and they are using the language that we all use. And I do think there is an element of the humanities that is both specific and a very particular type of analysis, but I hope that the humanities open up a bit broader than that. And I think that's actually what this festival is about. The humanities encompasses a type of communication which is open to all. And I think, although I disagree with Wilson about berating humanists for too much jargon, I think you're allowed to have that. Scientists have their jargon, humanists do. But I do think there should be a meeting point. And I think that meeting point is language, the graphic, the communicative openness to the world. And I don't know if that's an answer, but we can talk about it later if there's other ways to refine the answer.
Great. We've got a question right down here in front.
How do you see the implication of what you just told us for curriculum development in starting in elementary school through junior high through high school?
Well, I mean, you just mentioned all the things I know nothing about, really, sort of kindergarten through high school. I would say certainly at the college level, we're doing it. And so in some ways, rather than saying I don't have a particular plan to enact this because the liberal arts is this. This is what I have learnt. You can tell I'm not just putting this accent on. I grew up in England, and there you don't have that notion of the liberal arts that I came to know and love in the United States. In schools, I think, I would say more just in our culture, we have to be very wary about, and maybe this does get back to the question, I think we have to be wary about pigeonholing people. I think at a very young age, sometimes we tell students, oh, you're of that type of mind, or you're of that type of mind. And I think pigeonholing can be inimical to the type of consilience or commiscience that I'd like to see. I really don't know enough about education at the earlier levels. I think when I was saying about maybe practice and knowledge, I think sometimes we fetishize experiential learning, which means something outside the classroom. I like to see experiential knowledge in the classroom. And what does that mean? For me, it can also mean listening well. It doesn't have to mean that you're making something to be experiencing something. But I do think having students think about what it is to make things and do things, whether it's writing or making a solar energy run a car, I mean, I think all of that sort of action should be encompassed in education. I can really imagine that would be salutary in, from the lower levels. So thank you.
We have time for just one more question. Anyone?
Oh, you did have your hand up.
You did?
Yes.
Okay. Great. Could you pass this down to him?
Do inventors are the ones that make the most of mixing practice and knowledge together?
Say it again.
Are inventors the ones that are the most likely to mix practice and knowledge together?
Oh, the artists?
The inventors.
Oh, the inventors, absolutely. Oh, my God. I mean, in fact, another lecture I think I would talk about, I mean, I'm lecturing now, I'm doing a class, and I talk about the word invention is a fascinating word, I think. What it is to find things, and I think it does speak of a certain, rather than a profession, maybe more of a mode of thinking. And I think trying to, in fact, maybe that's the answer to your question. Maybe investing education with the excitement of invention might be a good way to sort of round out the knowledge and practice type of equation I was putting together to say, how can we have people feel so excited about their education because they feel they are on the cusp of inventing something. And inventing is an interesting word because it sounds like you're just producing something out of nothing, but of course the Latin root is to find something. And I like that ambivalence again of course you are an individual trying to produce something, but you're also discovering something that's almost always already there. Because as Newton said, and John of Salisbury said in the 12th century before him, we stand on the shoulders of giants. You know, we're always building on what came before us. And I think invention is a great word for that. So why don't we let that be the last word for today. Thank you.